first moved to New York, we had a great apartment that was dirt cheap.
And we found out why it was so cheap.
Our friend Amy said there was a great apartment in her building.
Dirt cheap, but it's a hotel for women. Okay, we made one adjustment.
Now these other ladies know us as Buffy and Hildegard.
I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Like you, be strong to hold the powers of the sun.
Listen to Pavarotti.
Can I be your superhero?
Hello, welcome to The Revealing. I am your host, Pavarotti, and I'm here to discuss the Idaho 4 case. And what I want to do now, it's been a really busy weekend, had time to clear my head, is dig back in where I left off on the roommate situation. Because y'all know that it is my firm belief that more than likely Bethany was not there all evening, and Dylan left about 2:13 and went to wherever she went, but later on that night she more than likely ended up back in the hotel room with, I believe, Bethany. And I believe there's a lot of evidence that backs that up. I'm going to give that over the next couple of videos. But in this first video, we're going to revisit some things that helped us determine our belief in this matter. And one of them is a court document from Ann Taylor, as she clearly outlines the importance of a particular situation around the roommates and their friends who arrived at the 911 call. And I think that gave us a lot of insight and verification, in my opinion. But we're going to revisit that, and then we're going to revisit the hotel that I absolutely believe that they were at that night, and that being the Monarch Hotel. And I went through that in a video a while back that showed you why I believe that. So we're going to reaffirm those two things in this one, and then the next video we're going to dive in really deep. So let's get started. Now, y'all know I always like to be able to back up any assertions that I make out of the actual record, as close to the record as we can possibly get to the truth. And when we talk about this situation, there's no doubt that all of law enforcement's efforts seem to focus around the statements of Dylan and what she did that night. And a timeline of the events of that night correlated with a timeline of all of the statements that she gave to law enforcement after the atrocity, I believe is very telling. And I believe it's really going to tie into what Ann Taylor said in one of her responses. So as we go through this, we know the 911 call, first of all, was made according to the record at 11:56 a.m., and Officer Nunez was supposedly the first officer on scene. I happen to believe that, I think Gunderson was there before Nunez, but the record shows that it was Nunez. And you can see that same day, at approximately 11:56 a.m., a 911 call was placed from 1122 King Road for a reported unresponsive female. Talk about that all year. Moscow Police Department responded to the scene, and Officer Mitch Nunez took a statement from DM. She told Officer Nunez she saw a male, not insanely tall, wearing all black and a mask that was just covering his forehead and mouth. So we can assume that this first interview must have happened not long after law enforcement supposedly arrived for the 911 call. And we know that because the next interview happened just a short time later. And the next interview was at 1:47 that day. So between 11:56 and 1:47, a statement was given to Nunez. And then at approximately 1:47 that same day, DM was interviewed at the Moscow Police Department by Detective Lawrence Mowry. During this interview, DM reported she saw a white male she did not know, maybe my height, few inches taller, skinny, athletic built, and he was wearing a mask that covered his mouth and nose. But the Mowry interviews DM just over an hour later for interview 2. So these are the two main interviews that DM had with law enforcement. And these are the only two interviews that happened that day. Now, if there was an interview that happened the next day where a lot of new information came out, then that would be interesting. But that didn't happen. The next interview did not happen for 4 days. So the third interview, which was on November the 17th, was with, Detective Gooch from Idaho State Police. So 4 days later, DM was interviewed by Idaho State Police Detective Victoria Gooch and MPD Captain Dustin Blaker. She gave a detailed recounting of what she did on Saturday, November 12th, until she went to bed at approximately 3:20 on Sunday. Created a contact at 3:51. I guess she didn't mention that. But that was on Sunday, November 13th, 2022. So there's 3 interviews with Miss Dillon. Then the next interview wasn't until December the 1st, and that was with Detective Williamson. So on December 1st, 2022, 18 days after her first interview, DM was interviewed by forensic interviewer Erin Williamson. She gave a detailed accounting of her day on Saturday, November 12th, until she went to bed on Sunday, November 13th. So there's the 4 main interviews with Dillon. The first 2 happening right after the law enforcement supposedly arrived for the 911 call, 4 days later for Gooch, and then December 1st with Williamson. And then the 5th interview and the last interview happened on December the 30th. And on December 29th, when defendant was arrested in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, the following day on December 30th, 2022, 47 days after her first interview, DM was interviewed by Idaho State Police detectives. They asked DM whether she had seen a picture of defendant. She stated she had seen the mugshot, but had no clue whether defendant was the person she saw in her house. So basically, she didn't know. No, that's not a positive ID. But these are all the interviews that took place with Dillon. The first 2 being the most important because they were the ones that happened, closest to the crime. So when we go to this statement in one of the court docs, it says, in this case, not only was there an 8-hour delay in reporting prior to the first law enforcement interview, DM, and this is a key statement right here. Look, prior to the first law enforcement interview. So the first law enforcement interview we just established was right after law enforcement supposedly arrived, just after 11:56. But prior to that interview, DM was allowed to mingle with BF and many other friends. Prior to that interview, DM was allowed to mingle with BF and many other friends. Law enforcement did not separate all the friends who came to 1122 King Road prior to interviews. Wait a minute. So if DM was allowed to mingle with BF and many other friends, but these other friends arrived at the King Road residence prior to interviews? Let's think about this for a second. Law enforcement did not separate the friends. There was no warning given to discuss the facts, and no effort was made to limit such a discussion. So these are the friends that arrived prior to the 911 call. So when they're talking about DM was allowed to mingle with BF and many other friends, I believe what she is specifically talking about, or who she's specifically talking about, is BF, Hunter, and Emily, because those are the only friends that were there prior to the 911 call. And if this interview happened directly after the event, those are probably the only friends that she was allowed to mingle with. But now there could have been other people that showed up as well, but these are the only ones that's been identified in the court dockets. So these are the ones that I'm thinking about focusing in on. And then it says, many of the friends who were at 1122 King Road when police arrived. So that really does limit it to Bethany, Hunter, and Emily. Because as we heard on the 911 call, it was just It was just Dylan, Bethany, Hunter, and Emily at the house. And when they made the 911 call and the operator confirmed the address, Nunez, Nunez. He was there within 1 minute and 20 something seconds after the operator confirmed the address. So that wouldn't have allowed time for anybody else, if this was a legitimate situation, to show up. So the friends that I believe that Ann Taylor's referring to is BF, Hunter, and Emily. And then she goes on to state, again, no warning was given to not discuss the facts and no effort was made to limit such a discussion. And then many of the friends who were at 1122 King Road when police arrived also stayed in the same hotel room the night of November 13, 2022. Also stayed in the same hotel room the night of November 13, 2022. So, if everything that I'm saying is correct, the friends who stayed in the same hotel room the night of November 13, 2022, it almost assumes that DM stayed there with her friends because they were allowed to discuss facts. But it tells me the people in this hotel room was Bethany, Hunter, Emily. Dylan must have joined them at some point. Maybe there was somebody else there. But a lot of people look at this and they go, well, that says the night of November 13th, Pavarotti, not the night of November 12th. And I understand when you say that, but I also know that most of the time when they talk about that horrible night on King Road, they also talk about it being November 13th. But prior to the first interview with Nunez, DM was allowed to mingle with BF and many other friends, being Hunter and Emily. Many of the friends who were at 1122 King when police arrived also stayed in the same hotel room the night of November 12, 2022. So when it says many of the friends, it doesn't necessarily mean all of them, but it certainly suggests it, in my opinion. But let me give you some more data to back that up. All right, so if you've got Dylan, Bethany, Hunter, and Emily, they're the only people to be at the King Road residence prior to the 911 call, and the arrival of law enforcement was less than 1 minute and 20 seconds after the 911 operator confirmed the address, and many of those friends stayed in the same hotel room the night of November 13th, and you look at the night description, and November 13th, you think it's the next night. But also, when you go to the Moscow PD press releases, just to give you an example, on 11/16/22, I showed you this statement from their press release where it described the two roommates as the two other roommates were at the residence that night. So they were at the residence that night, the night of November 13th. Whenever they talk about night November 13th, you can bet they're talking about the time of the atrocity. But let's think about this in another way. Now, when you talk about any of the people that's surrounding the atrocity on King Road, they're all very young and college students. They all seem to come from, or most of them seem to come from, pretty good families who seem to care about them. And when we dive deep into, Dylan, we know that she was possibly on the phone with her father many times that night and that morning. And we also know that Bethany's family is very protective of her, and both of those families have connections in town with power. So you can imagine, that they really care about their children. And I'm sure their children, their youngsters, the other youngsters that were there, I'm sure their family cares about them as well as any of the friends of the victims in this case. I imagine their family all cares about them very much. So when you think about it for just a second, and just use a little deduction, you have a quadruple homicide in the college and they're friends of your children. Put yourself in their position. Nobody knows who did it, according to the record, and everything certainly would be in play. Everybody looks like they're in danger. So would the parents of the roommates, would the parents of their friends really just sit back and allow them to go get a hotel room that night after all of this took place by themselves and let them continue just living as usual? Or would they probably at breakneck speed, break every traffic law to get to that town to get their hands on their children and make sure that they are safe and in their sight? I think that's the response most parents would have in a situation like that. So the reasoning behind all of them staying in the same hotel room the next night, like they're just independent adults and they can do what they want, it isn't flying with me. I believe their parents would be all over it. We know that, Bethany was on the phone with her parents all morning. So you can bet they were there to put their hands on her and they weren't staying in any hotel rooms that night. But the other thing I think is important is when you really look at what Ann Taylor was saying right there, she was saying that they were allowed to mingle before the interviews after the 911 call. And those interviews happened fast. And the only people that were there to mingle, as we just discussed, was Dylan, Bethany, Hunter, and Emily. So that is what she is stating is very important, is they were allowed to mingle. She also stated in another document that Bethany and Dylan had 8 hours to sit there and discuss, the situation. So that coupled with that tells me that the interviews that she was pointing to were those first two interviews that day with Nunez and Mowry, because it wouldn't make as much sense for them to talk about creating stories for the third interview that didn't happen until 4 days later with Gooch. And would it really matter if they were in the same hotel room the night of the 13th after the atrocity, after the first two interviews? Because who knows where they were at the 14th, 15th, and 16th, and then the interview was on the 17th. So the impact of collusion at that point couldn't even be tracked. But the impact of collusion before those first two interviews could be tracked if, like Ann Taylor stated, they were in a hotel room. And you can bet if they were in a hotel room, Bethany was there, and eventually Dylan would make her way there. And we even know what hotel it was. I mean, all the investigating in the case has pretty much shown us that it was the Monarch Hotel. Let me let you revisit that video that I did on where Dylan was that night at the Monarch Hotel between 9 and 2. Now, we don't know if it was at 9 p.m. that she was at the Monarch Hotel or if it was later on, or maybe a combination thereof. But you can bet they've got documentation she was at that Monarch Hotel at some point. Right here in the defense's response to the state's motion in limine to introduce self-authenticating records. And right here at number 46, Umpqua bank records for DM. Hard drive provided on April 5th, 2023. Audio video 261. And when you go down here to the audio video 000261, this disclosure contains DM's banking records. Additionally, this disclosure contains a copy of a grand jury subpoena and a letter of instruction. Little footnote 1 right here. This is how I found this whole thing, from this little footnote 1. The state has not provided any specifics related to what it intends to rely on or use as evidence, nor a certificate that records or videos were made and kept in the course of a regularly conducted business activity, and if it was the regular practice of that business to make the report or record. But key words right here. This is Umpqua Bank Records for DM. It's an audio video file. It says it contains records and videos that were made and kept in the course of regularly conducted business activity. And this contains copy of grand jury subpoena and a letter of instruction with a footnote 1. Number 1, exhibit objection to state's motion, federal grand jury subpoena. So it won't tell us which motion that was that the state objected to, but we know it has something to do with the federal grand jury subpoenas. And what has Ann Taylor been trying to get her hands on since the very beginning? The initial grand jury subpoena that was filed for a couple of the warrants in this case.
All right, let's start with the grand jury subpoenas. And yeah, we wanted those in discovery. We didn't get those. We were told no a couple of different times.
I can quickly go through grand jury subpoenas. At the end of the day, their desire still, this has come up several times throughout this process, their desire to see the actual grand jury subpoenas is not the basis for a Franks hearing. There's just simply no legal basis to support that idea. And there is nothing obtained that was obtained in violation of any of the defendant's constitutional rights. They say they needed to know the scope, but it is not clear to the state how that would have made any difference in the probable cause determination or why the magistrate would need to know that.
Well, it turns out that it looks like this particular one right here was one of interest by the defense. March 7th of 2023. And this is the order to seal and redact none other than the Umpqua Bank warrant. You can see this is Umpqua Bank at 609 South Washington Street in Moscow, Idaho. And when we go through and we look, again, this is when it was sealed and redacted. But when was this search warrant filed? It was filed by an affidavit of Lawrence Mowry on November 19th, 2022. Says he obtained a search warrant for Umpqua. The search warrant was served on 11/21 and 11/22 by FedEx and email. And on 11/23, he received the email from Umpqua, which contained the requested information. That's interesting. Umpqua Bank, 609 South Washington Street. On the 22nd day of November, 1:21 o'clock, Detective Mowry FedExed the warrant. And what did they want on 609 South Washington Street in Moscow? Oh, they wanted the security video. And we want to search, enter upon to said premises consist of information related to crimes of homicide committed at said premises consist of information related to crimes of homicide committed at 1122 King Road in Moscow, Idaho. And they want exterior camera surveillance footage from November 12th, 2022 at 9 p.m. Pacific time to November 13th, 2022 to 12 p.m. Pacific time, located in or upon the following described premises located in Latah County, state of Idaho. Umpqua Bank, 609 South Washington Street. And then when we go up to Umpqua Bank records for DM. But additionally, this disclosure contains a copy of a grand jury subpoena and a letter of instruction. There's that little number 1. The state has not produced any specifics related to what it intends to rely on or use as evidence, nor certificate that the records videos were made and kept in the course of a regularly conducted business activity. This is the Umpqua Bank at 609 South Washington Street. So when we come up here to 6th Street, so here is the ATM machine right here where they would have had surveillance video of a withdrawal. And you can see it's facing right here on 6th Street. Okay, here we go. Here's the Monarch Hotel. It's just 2 streets over. All right, so here's that Monarch Hotel where I believe they were at. And scanning around the Monarch Hotel, Banner Bank. Whoa, look at this. Banner Bank. How interesting is that? Directly across the street from the Monarch Hotel. Monarch Hotel, Grub Truck, Banner Bank. Banner Bank was kind of huge once I noticed it was right there. And you know, it's really easy to follow their bank records. And this warrant was sealed on December 7th. So they sealed the Umpqua on the 5th, and they seal Banner on the 7th. So you can follow the progression of their investigation fairly easily. They got the Umpqua Bank warrant put in on the 22nd of November and got it back on the 23rd. And you can see that the original warrant was for financial records for Ethan, Maddie, Xana, Kaylee, and 3 redacted individuals. You can bet 2 of those redacted individuals was Bethany and Dylan. Who the third one was is very curious. And they were looking for surveillance video and images for some of the transactions. Video surveillance and images to account transaction. But remember, when I just showed you this, they originally filed the search warrant for Ethan, Maddie, Kaylee, and Xana, and 2 or 3 unnamed individuals. We assume 2 of them was Bethany and Dylan. But now you can see by the time they were done, they had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 unnamed individuals. So who were the other unnamed individuals? I wonder if 2 of them could be Hunter and Emily. Now I'm going to show you the anatomy of a cover-up, y'all. Watch this, because all the information that I just showed you in itself is not alarming. But when you put it all together, it becomes very clear. The interviews of the roommates were conducted on November 13th, just minutes to hours after the atrocity. That was the first 2. I've showed you over the last few videos that the roommates were never mentioned by anybody until November the 16th, when it was just a passing statement answered in a press conference by Chief Fry that the roommates were in fact home, but he said they weren't witnesses or anything of that nature. So you can tell they were starting to craft something right there, but they weren't 100% sure what they needed to craft. And then in the press release later that day, it just simply said the roommates were home that night. But then the very next day, oddly, we get the 3rd interview with Detective Gooch on November the 17th. And in that interview, they get more information from DM and BF. And I believe they started looking into their story to see how they needed to craft this thing going further. And watch what happens. On November 18th, one day after the interview with DM by Gooch, they subpoena all the security footage for Umpqua Bank for Dylan. Now, they didn't receive that until November the 22nd. And then once they received that footage, what did they do on November the 23rd? Oh, excuse me, that was the Umpqua Bank warrant received. But on November the 23rd, the very next day, they filed a warrant for Banner Bank for all of its security video. Look at this. Boom, 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 boom. And then to make it even more apparent, they didn't get that security video back until December the 1st. And that would have showed them everybody that was at that hotel. And then what coincidentally happens on December 1st when they get all that footage back? Well, that just happens to be the day that they bring DM for her last interview until after the Koberger arrest on the very same day, December 1st, 2022. So now they've got outline movements of where they were. You can bet this December 1st interview where they got the other information from her, they made it clear with her on what the story would be from this point forward. So like a little timeline of making up an event and the events surrounding it and making sure everybody's on the same page with as much facts as they can back up to put them on the same page. Now, that's that. But how do we know who the lying party is here? Well, we know that more than likely both of them are lying. But I asked you that question. Is it DM, is it BF, or is it law enforcement, or is it a combination thereof? Well, I'm just going to go with the words of the defense team, and they seem to imply that it's a combination thereof in no uncertain terms. Because in this document, it clearly says defendant argues the addition of the word thought is false, which means it's a lie. And further, defendant surmises that it was intentionally false. So it was an intentional lie to cover up the fact that DM was wrong about what she had heard. So they're saying it was an intentional lie to cover up for DM. And who did the intentional lying? Law enforcement. And defendant points out, well, let's just skip to right here. Defendant contends that DM's misperception, which means they're not outright calling her a liar, had it not been covered up by law enforcement. Law enforcement cover-up claimed by the defense in black and white would have cast doubt on her reliability and therefore probable cause. So what is the defense saying? And you know, I go with whatever they say because they've really investigated this thing. They're saying that DM had misperceptions and she wasn't reliable and what she thought she heard was false, as in a lie, but it was intentionally false. It was added into the record intentionally false as a cover-up by none other than covered up by law enforcement. And when they say law enforcement in this, what they really mean are the three entities that met every single day to craft the story, as we heard in that interview with Chief Fry on November the 16th. He said every single day the investigators meet with the prosecution team and the university to make sure their story is straight. And that's exactly what they did. And what happened with their stories? Well, they intentionally made things up to cover up for other things that didn't make sense in the investigation. So tell me how we can trust that and trust even the fact that they were at home that night, which now we almost are certain they weren't. So to wrap this thing up in a bow, I think at the very least, some of the things we can surmise from this information is between Dylan, Bethany, Hunter, and Emily, some of them were at a hotel room that night. Dan Taylor was talking about how they had discussions before their initial interviews with apparently Nunez and Mowry. And I think it's irrefutable. I think once you go through the evidence, it's irrefutable that they were, I'm about 99% it was the Monarch Hotel. But also, when you start to look at that original question, who's lying? Law enforcement, roommates, or a combination thereof? It looks to me like the defense is stating it's a combination thereof, but it's leaning on more to the side of law enforcement cover-up. And they've explicitly said that in their court docs. But when you follow the progression of events as it relates to the roommates, starting with their interviews, the interview with Gooch, and then it goes directly into the Umpqua Bank video surveillance footage. We know Dylan was there between 9 and 12 because that's what the court record states. Then you follow that. Once they got that return back, it goes straight over to Banner Bank for their video footage. And then all of a sudden we've got all of the victims and 5 people's names redacted. I bet if we could get the redacted names of those 5 people, one would be Dylan, one would be Bethany, one would be Hunter, one would be Emily, and who knows who the other one is. But it would be very telling. So, yeah, this thing is going to be put together. Absolutely. Hopefully we can get it all put together before the actual trial. Then we can just go through the trial and just check off things that we already knew. But that was just another installment. I've still got a ton more coming to you. I just wanted to give you the premise of why I can say definitively why I believe that the roommates were not there that night before I get into the actual factual stuff. Please like and subscribe to the channel. Post your comments, thoughts, criticisms. Till next time, Pavarotti's out.
Oh, gonna give it a shot. Only one of me to shield you all from